Um, okay, good evening. Anais Nin wrote, I believe one writes because one has to create a world in which one can live. I could not live in any of the worlds offered to me. I had to create a world of my own, like a climate, a country, an atmosphere in which I could breathe, reign, and recreate myself when destroyed by living. A very good evening to all the attendees, esteemed faculty members, and research scholars who have joined us. It gives us an immense pleasure to welcome you all to Writing Worlds Writing, New Textualities and Their Online Lives, a national conference organized by the Department of English at St. Joseph University, Bangalore. The conference attempts to initiate discussions and debates on the changing nature of textual practices and their contemporary relevance. Our week-long conference is conducted in hybrid mode. The first 3 days sessions are conducted online mode, and from 23rd March to 25th, the paper and poster presentation, plenary sessions, workshops, and installations are conducted offline. The conference aims to discuss and debate the intertextual and metatextual configuration of new media, their immersive and interactive foundations, and raise relevant questions about how the writer, producer, reader axes are formulated in the current context. Today, day 3 of our national conference is going to be a live session on Techno Ramble, a conversation in contemporary science fiction. Today we have Samit Basu sir. He's an Indian novelist known mainly for science fiction and fantasy work. His most recent novel is the anti-dystopian near future, The City Inside, and it was on the Washington Post and Book Riot for the best science fiction of 2020 list, and earlier shortlisted for 2020 JCB Prize India as Chosen Spirit. Sir's first novel, The Simian Prophecies, is published by Penguin India in 2003 when he was just 23, and it was the first book in the best-selling Game World trilogy and marked the beginning of Indian English fantasy writing. His UK US debut was the superhero novel Turbulence. He also works as film director, screenwriter for Netflix, comics writer, children's writer, and columnist and essayist. So this session is going to be in a conversation mode, and to start the conversation, I would like to invite Cynthia ma'am.
Thank you. I'm so sorry that I didn't edit that bio violently before sending it in. Please have a drink of water.
Thank you, sir.
You're on mute, Cynthia.
Yes, thank you so much. Good evening, sir. It's an absolute delight to talk to you, and also a source of great intimidation in some ways.
Don't be intimidated. I mean, I hope you realize that it's intimidating for me to be talking to people who, if you're in college now, basically you were born around the time at which I started writing. So now I'm feeling positively geriatric. I hope I understand your questions and you can answer them with any degree of felicity. Please go on.
Yes, sir. I would like to start by telling you that I started reading Turbulence.
Hey.
And I loved reading it. I didn't realize this until I found myself laughing at random points in time when I was reading the book. And while I was reading the book, there were several questions that came to mind. So I thought I would ask you one of those questions that came to mind as a starting question. In one of your many interviews, you had talked about there being a dearth of Indian readers when it came to science fiction and fantasy written by Indian authors. And there was a scene, this is right in the beginning of the book Turbulence. So for those of you who are not very familiar with the novel, Turbulence is a book about people on a specific flight, BA Flight 142, gaining superhuman heroic abilities based on their deepest desires. This goes a little awry for some people in some ways. We'll come to that a little later. But as I was reading it, we looked at Veer Singh, who was flying without the help of anything. And there is a scene where a Pakistani pilot meets him. And Veer knows that the Pakistani pilot will probably think that he's American if he hasn't seen his face. I was very interested in this, and I wondered if it was a stretch to compare that to the state of Indian writing in English when it comes to fantasy and science fiction, because I remember reading a paper by a student called Nivedana Pandian from second MA English. She had talked about how there aren't a lot of fantasy and Indian and science fiction books written by Indian authors in English. When
Right,
she talked about the dearth of readership as well.
right,
And this made me wonder if um, Veer's absolute knowledge that nobody will recognize him as Indian until they see his face also reflects a certain kind of anxiety that comes from being an Indian writer writing science fiction. I'm not sure whether this is the case. I just wondered as I was reading. Um,
right.
so
Well, actually, there's an elaborate joke in Turbulence about how, and so I don't know if you finished it yet, but basically there's a point at which the Indian superheroes, having formed their superhero squad, reach a point where they'll have to go abroad before they're taken seriously in India, right?
mm,
And that is a condition not just for science fiction, but for the arts in general. You find that validation in many spaces is something Indians feel very comfortable about for a relatively new form only when that validation comes from the West. And then people go, ha, 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 yes, yes, we knew all along this was a thing. But first of all, Cynthia, I want to congratulate you on your hat. I think it is an excellent hat. I have only seen the bottom brim of it, but I feel like that you wear it with great flair, and it is lovely to be asked questions by someone wearing this hat. Um, I actually don't think there's a massive dearth of readers for fantasy and science fiction, because what happened was that, I mean, if you look at 20 years ago, whatever it was that my first book came out, it was a bestseller. Most of the, pretty much, at least in India, the numbers might not be astronomical, but pretty much every book that comes out is well received. Not every book, obviously, because now there are some 30, 40 different works published
mm,
by the mainstream publishing houses in fantasy and SF. But many of them have been well received. Many have sold well. What happens really, though? I mean, what is holding, at least in English, what is holding Indian science fiction fantasy back is that in the West, it's an entirely different publishing ecosystem, right?
mm,
And they have their own publishers, they have their own magazines, they have their own media. It's the whole mechanism for the creation, the production, the publicity, and the distribution of these books is kind of separate from more mainstream, your lit fic, your non-fic, your commercial fiction publishing. So in India, we simply do not have that system. So say books like mine or any of the other writers, they come out from the mainstream publishers, right? So what happens is that publishing really doesn't know what to do with these books. So when these books
mm,
succeed, they kind of succeed without any particular support. Um, and so but when they come out, they're as good or bad at finding audiences at books in any other genre. And this is partly because I don't think India reads by genre. India just reads by, oh, I've heard this book, or someone has told me about this book. Let's give it a try. This book is sitting in my school or college or local library. Let's give it a try. This book popped up on social media. Let's give it. So because nothing about publishing here, just like nothing about anything here, is in any way organized, right? So books come out, people read them. This idea that there isn't, there certainly isn't a lot of mainstream validation for SF and fantasy. And when I talk to writers who are starting out now, it seems very mysterious to them, for example, that in my 20s, I was in the papers a lot. But that's not a function of me being special in any way. What's happened is that there's much less book coverage in the newspapers, or there's none on TV anymore. Um,
mm,
when this coverage happens, it usually happens to like some celebrity or some friend of the editor or something like that, because the space is shrinking a lot. Right now, I happen to have started out in the Jurassic era when books pages were large, when features magazines were plentiful, when people were reading a lot more. Not, I mean, people are still reading a lot more all the time, but when people were reading a lot more of newspapers and magazines, so there was a relatively centralized way for people to hear about any new book that had come out.
mm,
Now, not only are there 50 new books a week, there's no coverage of them, right?
mm,
So the problem is not, there's not a lack of readers, because I've been lucky enough to find readers at every stage. And even, and this is something that, like, when I started getting published abroad, when I started getting published in the UK or the US or Germany or wherever these places, it's a lot easier for publishers to find readers there. They know where they are. The readers are gathered there at their pages and so on. And this is because there are mechanisms for the publishing of these books, which simply don't exist here. So that's the situation. Writers are constantly told, oh, there's no market for fantasy, there's no market for science fiction. Then when they say my name, or they say the name of a couple of other fantasy SF writers who've done well, they'll say, oh, they are different. They're not different. The readers are absolutely there.
Okay. That's very reassuring to hear, sir, because I came across this tiny snippet that I absolutely loved. You told people why to write and why not to write at the same time.
What year was this? I hope I agree with anything I said
remember the
then.
year.
Never mind. Carry on. I hope I still hold any of those views.
Okay. So you said if you write for yourself, don't
Yes.
expect validation necessarily, because you probably won't get it. And you said don't write also a little for the same reason, but then you came back and you said but write because and I found that absolutely beautiful.
Well, thank you. It's nice writing. And it's nice to like it. It's nice to do it. It's nice to remember that you like it. What I often find is that, and this is actually much harder for your generation because, for my generation also, obviously people wanted to be rich and people wanted to be famous. That's never gone away. But it's such an overwhelming part of culture now that often, this idea that, oh, I'd really love to write, but it seems quite intimidating. It seems very saturated. I don't really like the books that are marketed at me. The books I like are far away or old or something like that. I don't know how to, what the next step is. When I look for the next step online, then it seems very confusing and it seems to be in a direction that I don't particularly want to go in. This is not new. This has been the case unless you're a part of an extremely small kind of group of families from a very particular kind of, educational or social background. You have no connection to any of these places, right? So you just flounder around the internet and hope for the best. But the driving spirit behind it and the landing point for it are still the same. So but having said that, it is so difficult really to land a career in these spaces unless you're writing exactly the kind of book that publishers want. Right? It's very difficult to kind of carom board your way and find a space to write yourself. But writing for yourself, writing the sort of thing you actually enjoy is so much more fun than writing according to anyone else's, guidelines, which is why I'd recommend it at any stage.
Definitely, sir. One more question, the question I wanted to start with before I pass the metaphorical mic on to Gayatri. So I teach the open elective science fiction and fantasy for students from other combinations other than optional English. One of the questions that came up when we were talking about science fiction is, does science fiction need to have science in it? This is a question Arul sir raised.
Right.
And it's a question that I've been nibbling on ever since he said it.
Right.
I know you said that as Indians, we don't read by genre.
Yeah.
And I don't really believe in a very fixed idea of genre.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you what you thought about it also, because when I was reading Turbulence,
right,
there were a lot of things that I associated a lot with fantasy, but it also bled a lot into science fiction.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this, sir?
Well, honestly, see, it's the thing about genre classification, right? And especially in India, where the industries don't particularly exist, is that genre classification in India is of value to, actually, no, not just India, genre classification anywhere is of particular value to two sets of people. One is academics, and one is publishing marketing departments, right? In both cases, the function it essentially serves is to funnel a large mass of, multi-directional confusing things into something that some order can be assigned. So as an
Mm.
academic, you would classify by genre in order to study lines of commonality, lines of intersection between specific works, whatever your context, whatever your framework of analysis is. As a publishing marketer, you would say, okay, this then goes into this shelf in the bookstore, this then goes to this set of magazines, and so on. And this is in countries where the options exist. As far as anyone else is concerned, right, genre can mean two things. One is people like to identify themselves with certain fandoms, right?
Mm.
So, so you have your Harry Potter fandom, which used to be cool and now is not. You have your Game of Thrones fandom, you have your Star Wars fandom, MCU fandom, and fandoms of more and more kind of, as you progress along the lines of how niche they are, the more fierce the fandom gets. Now, that's when you get into the kind of territory I like to call the Premier League territory, where you have people in Bangalore and Delhi and Calcutta being diehard fans of Tottenham Hotspur, right? But they're not watching any Indian football, and they'll buy the merchandise, but Tottenham Hotspur doesn't know they exist. Right. And Tottenham Hotspur doesn't care whether and there you have a very fierce kind of, genre classification. This means that, etc., which is sweet. And it's part of what fandom is about, because fandom is about having really intense arguments about obscure things. But for a lot of people in this country, like something like science fiction is a nebulous term that is used to kind of describe a wide range of things. So I didn't grow up reading my genre. I grew up reading across genres. I grew up consuming across media, various cultures, various sources, and all of that. So my sense of science fiction or fantasy starting out was basically like, okay, if it's got spaceships, it's science fiction. If it's got wizards, it's fantasy, right? But it was not something that ever kind of caused there was no need to kind of delineate and differentiate between those two. Now that comes up only when you are looking at finding a particular publishing category. So now, since I've, since Chosen Spirits of the City Inside and the new book that is coming out this October, those are unambiguously science fiction, because what I'm doing by making it science fiction is making life easier for my publishers, right? With Turbulence, this was a difficult thing because no one knew whether superhero fiction fell under fantasy or science fiction or under what. Because it's not something that a lot of books had been written in. So, and even internationally, they weren't sure. So again, no one particularly cares. And I don't really, there's so much drama about this. Like there's science fiction or fantasy works calling themselves litfic because they don't want the stigma of genre association. There's science fiction, and there's work that goes the opposite way as well. There's what is clearly litfic with a little kind of, paint covering of imagery from the speculative genres, that is calling itself SF fantasy because it couldn't find a publisher in litfic, right? So it's a very case by case basis. But the broader answer of, is science necessary in science fiction? It's not necessary, but it helps. But there's lots of science in fantasy also. There's a genre called science fantasy. So as far as I'm concerned, broadly speaking, it's I know it when I see it. So if you have wizards with laser guns, for example, and if at the end of the book someone asks me to say, was that science fiction or fantasy? First, I will refuse to answer unless they pay me. But if they do pay me, it will depend on how the book felt. I think if the concerns were more about the interaction of people, where technology in whatever way was a very significant factor in the core storytelling, then it would be science fiction. If said technology was so advanced that it was essentially magical and no one made up a pseudoscientific explanation to say, oh, this is teleportation, but it's faster than light, and we do it with these magic travelotron particles that we have discovered. It's all the same, basically, right? So it doesn't really matter. That's why I like speculative fiction in the term, because it's basically saying, yeah, we're not obeying the laws of physics. That's all. Like we're not pretending to exist in some normal place. In any case, all books are fantasy novels. Like I've never felt. So, so let's say I grew up in that prehistoric time when people were reading Enid Blyton a lot, which people now still read in India, but only in India. Um, so I didn't find it any more difficult to travel to the famous Fives island than I found it to travel to Middle Earth. Right? I traveled to both places. I was fine with either place. In neither place did I feel like I needed to be represented, because that was just not an expectation I had when I was reading basically white people books. So the kind of what shall I say, the kind of spiritual visa form filling that we do by training from childhood. Once you've done that, then genre doesn't matter. Like I don't know about you, but I don't read books because they're fantasy or science fiction. I read books because someone tells me they're good.
I read books mostly because of the covers.
There you go. The cover told you it was good.
Yeah.
Then you felt bitter disappointment sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there have been times when I picked up some very Blair looking book and it turned out to be beautiful and mind blowing.
Yeah. You need a different algorithm of selection, I feel.
Sir, by the way, speaking of uncool fandoms, this is the Harry Potter hat.
Yes. Listen, I really love the first three books. I will always love them. I don't like, I've blocked J.K. Rowling. I don't care. Those books were good books.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, Gayatri.
Okay, so I had a strange question.
Go for it.
So we are living in a time period where everything that science fiction has, warned us about is kind of coming true around us, right?
Yeah.
And when that is the case, what role does a science fiction author have? As in, like, even if you tell stories right now, whether they are stories of that warn about the future or warn about what present, if we don't do something presently, there might be calamities and stuff. So, you would be end up people would end up saying that, okay, what new are you saying, right? So that's something which I'm curious about, as in, like, what would science fiction authors speculate right now, like, and this is something which I'm wondering, because as I read your bio, I remember reading the line anti-dystopian word associated for the novel The City Inside. So do you think is the role of science fiction authors right now to be anti-dystopian, like kind of give a
Well, okay, that's a very interesting question, and that is a question that always comes up when science fiction or speculative fiction, especially when near future fiction is described, right? And The Chosen Spirits in India, The City Inside in the US and Canada is a book that is set in Delhi 10 years in the future, right? And so there was and the reason it's set 10 years and in the future and not further off is because I wanted my predictions to actually be fairly accurate, because the further we go into the future, the harder it is to make accurate predictions of any kind, because you don't know what the next world-changing calamity or the world-changing piece of technology will be and when it will come. So, though speculative fiction does speculate on various things, but throughout the history of literature, science fiction, whatever, it has never been the job of the science fiction writer to predict the future accurately, right? If there is a job of the science fiction writer or the futurist, it is to reflect the concerns of the present day, projected into whatever future, not to do a balance sheet accountancy of it. So the role of the SF author in any period is to project the hopes and fears of the present day into a canvas that is speculative in whatever sense. So, which is why, broadly speaking, so much of kind of white sci-fi is about, empire expanding, conquering the kind of savage frontiers of the unknown. When society was obsessed with space travel, most of SF was space. Now, so much of SF is about internality. It's about relationship with technology. It's about AI taking over, etc., etc. But the job of the SF writer is basically the articulation of those dreams and those fears, which are absolutely about the now. And that is one thing that also I think often helps me do a vibe check of whether a work is SF or fantasy, which is that SF is much more constrained by the need to reflect the hopes and dreams of humanity in the present, even if it's in a galaxy far, far away, even if it's 5 minutes into the future. Um, and what happens is, as time passes and technology catches up with the idea of technology, you know, then people look back and say, oh, this person predicted this at this point of time. But the thing is that people have always been predicting various things that humanity has then achieved, right? Like you have, and which is why every SF writer also gets say, but in our myths also we have space travel, etc., etc. It's just that these have always been sort of collective dreams and collective desires, and science has worked towards realizing them. When we didn't have the visual metaphor or the technological metaphor to express these dreams in the form of technology, we express them in the form of magic, right? So which is one of the fundamental linkages between fantasy and SF, and which is one of the reasons that I find the classifications between them somewhat artificial, is that so much of it is about visual metaphor. So much of it, whether you call your connecting link element unobtainium or you have an unobtainious spell that does the same thing. The point is you're basically taking a shortcut between a desire and its fulfillment, right? So as far as the role of future prediction cannot be done. There are estimates people can make, but if anyone is pretending to accurately present the future, they are a fraud. Unless you're looking at a vibes-based future prediction, like which is basically astrology, whatever you call it, right? And so people can believe in that. There is always an intersection between a prediction made and your interpretation of how it came true, but it is not a science. Future prediction is, and which is why when I get think tanks coming to me and say, as a near future predictor, we find this monetizable. Will you? I'm like, no, please go away. I'm not a fraud. You are clearly a fraud. Enjoy your money. I have work. Right. That is where this is. So this whole field of futurism is well monetized people talking. And eventually, say when there's a pandemic, 50 people had predicted it many years ago. No one listened to them, right? So the thing is, in a science fiction conference, it is of course the tendency of many. I was just in another one. I was just in a science fiction conference where it was decided around the table that science fiction was very important. And it was decided around the table that science fiction writers were very key to the future of humanity. This is not true, So if it were a Lego manufacturers conference, people would decide that civilization could not proceed without Lego. So that's where we are. So that's what I broadly think about. The role of the science fiction writer is to tell a good story, and that's it. Then because what used to happen, especially in India, because now we're having this conversation in 2023 in what a few years ago would have been magical technology that didn't exist, right? Like we've basically seen this only in Star Trek, or first in Star Trek, this conversation that we're having right now. And the first 1/3 of everything was, how do we define science fiction? And usually, as the only writer present, my head would be in my hands already, like, please don't, because this is going to be a good 40 minutes of stuff I heard in the last panel. So, like, I think it's important for people in the field of science fiction to not think of future prediction, saving humanity, performing a vital role in society as their fundamental job. If it happens, if that's someone's perception, that's great. But that's about where I stand.
Thank you, sir. I had a question which was connected to what you also said about mythologies and how, so I I think even Cynthia ma'am can kind of join in on this because she, as we were having a conversation before this session, she referenced something in Turbulence also. So the question is, you know, right now we live in a world where a lot of people associate a lot of speculations which happens in myths as
Yeah.
facts, right?
Yeah.
And to write in that kind of space,
Yeah.
especially speculative fiction, seems dangerous
Yeah.
in two sense.
Because it
One,
is. Yeah. Go on.
in one sense, there is this fear that you might be considered as somebody who is breaking the already established truths which they hold dear,
Yeah.
and the other is them or people just taking the whatever speculation you have as truths.
Yeah.
So um, what is your, like, how do you handle these fears, as in do you have these fears, or do you
Well, I mean, I suppose at some baseline level, I have these fears. What I don't have is any concerns about these fears, in the sense that if someone like, I think what happens when a social decline happens, right? And I think anywhere in the world, if anyone is asked, is a social decline happening, they will by and large say yes. Democracies around the world are teetering. Um, Everyone is offended by everything. And you know, it I mean, and especially when it comes to things like mythology and religious symbols, and mythology is also in India, it's a very kind of vague, polite term to use, because we're talking about religion, right? We're talking about people and their religious sentiments, and mythology is just a polite word to that people like to use when they don't want to admit that it's just about religion. Um, so yes, we live in a very dangerous country now. Um, but there's always ways to say, I would never advise people to kind of self-censor when they're doing their writing, because what happens is when you're working with any corporation, and publishers are corporations and movie houses are corporations, um you are filtered from direct damage by 15 numbers of people who will try to censor anything that you're saying. So by the time you finish fighting with all of them and your thing is out in the world, chances are that a number of lawyers and a number of people have been saying, fine, no one is going to come and burn our house down today. That said, these are horrible conditions under which to be a writer. So these are situations where I'm not particularly bothered, because in so many ways I'm protected by social privilege. Also, there's lots of things I'm not touching, because it's like, publisher, we're now in a situation where if I say anything controversial, because I'm lucky enough to get a certain amount of attention, publishers will walk away. There's nothing I can do about that. I can publish indie if I want, right? But that's very laborious. So then you find ways, and the speculative genres are a good place to do that. You find ways to say what you want to say through metaphor, through allegory, through displacement, where you're saying the things you want to say, but you're not saying them in the specific metaphors and the specific locations where people are going to come and attack you for saying them. And if you look at the rise of, say, Chinese speculative fiction in since the mid 2010s, well, it's always been around. It's been around since the 60s, 70s in a very formalized state. But the global expansion of Chinese speculative fiction over the last decade, a lot of the near future stuff is people who are not allowed to express dissatisfaction with the real world, expressing dissatisfaction with made up worlds, which makes these works very relevant and very interesting works of political fiction, where they're called science fiction. But ultimately, like everything else, it boils down to the people of the time, and so there are ways and means to say whatever you want to say. And a lot of it, I would say, is the problem is offense in India and apathy outside. So every society has its own ways of enforcing various unpleasant conformities. Um, so as a writer, the more years you spend writing, you find your ways to navigate around these, to avoid these, to sidestep these, to find some way of, if there's something you want to say very badly, you find a way to say it. That's part of the challenge of writing. right? I mean, the act of writing itself is obviously very challenging because, it's hard. Um, but so is the act of publishing, and so is the act of finding that link between the things you want to say or the things you might have fun saying, um, and the other side of the Venn diagram, which is what do people want to read, what do people want to publish, where do they want to publish it. So it's a large set of multi-directional yet intersectional challenges. So then you over the years you figure out how to do it.
Cynthia, ma'am, do you want to add on to the?
Yes, this is slightly tangential. But in my conversation with Gayatri, we landed on this point about speculation being dangerous, possibly. But another thing that we talked about was also speculation being hard in itself. And this is something that I often wonder about when I read fantasy and read science fiction, read speculative fiction in general. I think about the kind of imagination it takes to bring up these ideas. And Gayatri and I were talking about this difficulty sometimes. Because when I try to think about it, it seems a little out of reach a lot of the time, unless I jot down some idea that comes to me in some rare moment. So I wanted to ask a question about the difficulty in speculation, and maybe speculation as a skill as well. And that's connected to something else that I wanted to ask you, sir. This is not really related to science fiction or speculative fiction in any way. But one thing that I noticed in your writing and loved about your writing was the human touch that kind of comes through in every single scene. I saw this in Veer's desire to fly, and when he thinks about how somebody who flies should feel the sky and the wind and the elements on his face. I saw this when he was in a very potentially dangerous situation and he thinks about his uncle, and in a very surreal situation, and he thinks about his uncle saying once that insanity ran in the family. There were many sometimes jarring points at which I completely related with the characters, but points at which I did not expect to relate with them. So I wanted to ask you about both these aspects, because they are both very connected to imagination. And yes, sir.
Right. So, okay, that's a very big question and a very hard question. And first of all, I'm thank you for asking it. It's a lovely question. When it comes, I mean, if I'm looking at the first part of your question is essentially how do you imagine something, right? That's, first of all, that's kind of impossible to answer, but let me try. Let me ask you a question, in fact, which you can answer as elaborately or as briefly as you want. Would you find it more difficult to imagine a scene, a fictional scene where just, I don't know, two sisters are talking to each other? Would you find it, in your college? What for you would be the difference between those same two sisters having that same conversation on a spaceship?
Oh, things associated with the location, maybe. I don't know, maybe they are floating around on the spaceship, in the spaceship.
Yeah.
But I think the core element of the conversation would probably remain the same. They might be catily fighting.
So that's it. You just did the speculation part of the speculative fiction. So then what's your problem? Like, I'm not understanding it, because we're bombarded with visual imagery, right? So you take the core of the scene, what is happening to the people in them, and then just adjust the background in your head, and then you think about how the background affects the people and the conversation, as you just did by saying that they would be floating, and then it's the same scene. Like, there is nothing. What I often find amusing about when people are just like, I don't read science fiction or I don't read fantasy. It's the same thing as any other kind of book. It's a story about people. Sometimes it's a story about ideas. Sometimes it's a story about objects, right? But stories about ideas and story about objects exist in every sort of fiction. So between people and ideas and objects and places and themes, I don't really see what the difference is. It's just that some stories are best suited um for telling in non-regular situations. Sometimes it's just more fun to kind of um, dial up the visuals a bit, dial up the setting a bit, marry an idea to a human moment and see what happens. But it's not fundamental. Like I've written across genres, right? I've written kind of kids books and rom-coms and various other things. I don't see the difference. It's just, let's say I'm in Delhi right now and it's raining and there's possibly some monkeys roaming around outside and it's quite noisy. I have a sense of what the setting of my physical location is. So all I have to do if I want this to be, I don't know, hell, which Delhi sometimes feels like. All I have to do is imagine that it's hotter, like a lot hotter. So it's not, I think a lot of it is about just giving yourself as a writer the space and the confidence to not hold back. Once that's there, then as far as the writing part of it is concerned, you're fine. You run into challenges when it comes to the publishing part of it or the categorization part of it, because then you're running into the maze of other people's expectations, right? But I'm actually interested in this. Like if you're writing SF and fantasy and you just allow yourself to do it, I don't really think anyone is really inventing anything, right? There's 18,000 tools you can use in any situation. So you just pick a combination of them and you do your best. Okay, so that long-winded answer was for the first part of your question. The second part is that, thank you, first of all, for saying that you found people relatable and in their human moments in unexpected times. That I think, so, I think where a lot of people might differ in their approach to the nerdy genres is sometimes people think that SF has to be about the science or to be about the technology. And the whole thing is kind of an essay about that particular idea. And the people in it are usually talking heads, or people who are like lab rats on whom that idea is being executed. So they live or they die, but they're not the core of the story. The core of the story is the idea. Or the core of the story is the specific machine which is being machined in the story. So I feel like, that of course is a perfect legitimate way to approach things. And it again depends on the writer and it depends on the reader. And if they have that intersection through those wondrous machines, then good for them. I hate those. It's not like I hate them, but I'm bored by them. In the sense, I'd rather read a 5-line summary of the idea somewhere. I find that interesting. I don't particularly enjoy stories where the people are just props or talking heads to expound on a theme. I find a lot of joy by being in the moment with the characters doing the thing. And if the thing is extra amazing, then I'm having a really good time. So any of the things that you were kind about happened because I was wondering how would I be feeling in this person's place, right? Because there are some times where writing is kind of similar to acting, where fortunately people don't have to look at me acting out the characters in my books. Very, very sad. But at least in your head, you're going to that place, right? You're turning yourself into that person. You're in the situation that person is in. You're doing the thing. You're thinking the thing that person will be thinking, and that for me is one of the biggest joys of writing, because it's that thing where that difference between, there's this internet meme about a horse, right? Where the first 1/3 is lavishly drawn horse, and the last part is that squiggle of the horse's bum, and writing often feels like that. It's so much better when you're kind of in your internal holodeck picturing the scene. And then when you put it down on the page, it feels awful. And it feels less and less awful as you hopefully get better at it. But there's a signal loss that happens in that. So, I really think that it's just a matter of allowing yourself to enjoy it And especially since you're also in academia and you're teaching and you're looking at other people's writing and all of that, it's very hard to let go. For people in academia, people in publishing, people in anything where there's this confluence of language and also established standards and practices and set formats of what works and what doesn't. Fiction can be challenged because part of the process is not using your editor brain or your professor brain or that to constantly grade your own work or judge your own work as you're writing it. These acts are in direct conflict as you're putting words on the screen or the page. So you will have to let that go. In the sense, you will have to tell your inner teacher or your inner editor to take a walk, put on your hat, and go for it. Like that's the solution to all these problems.
I think that answered the question that I had as a follow-up of sorts.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, science fiction and fantasy is usually constrained by a certain set of internal rules within the book. And I've always been worried about those internal rules while writing or while trying to write science fiction.
Yeah.
But I think you answered that question when you...
Right. Well, I mean, then let's just move on to the next. I think that, the problem with writing fiction is that reality is not constrained by any need to be logical. But fiction is. So, and the reader's suspension of disbelief and the extent to which you can carry it is a very precious thing, because when you lose them, you lose them. And the same thing for, films or TV or humans. When they've gone past your credibility borders, it's done. So yeah, but I don't think that's a major challenge. I think, somebody or other through the publishing process will hopefully spot a big plot hole if it's there. But if you're thinking about it and if you're worried about it, chances are you'll be fine.
Okay. Sir, I think we're coming, I think it's been a while since we've started, so we can look at the questions that the audience has raised.
All right, I can see them. Can you please tell us more on hyper-reality in science fiction, especially how identity crisis in science fiction novels can be related to hyper-reality as a theory? No, I have no idea what you're talking about. If you want to rephrase the question to like simpler terms, then maybe I can try. Let me look at the next question in the meantime. We live in a world governed by laws of nature and laws made by us, the humans. We cannot at any time distinguish one from the other. We kind of can. We can distinguish pretty easily between a law of nature and laws made us by humans. The ones that make no sense are the ones made by humans. The rest of them, you kind of look at them and we cannot. What are your thoughts on these classifications? Does science really have to be strange? Is Stranger Things a science fiction? Is Stranger Things a science fiction? Is an easy thing. It is if you want it to be. It's horror if you want it to be. It's 80s nostalgia if you want it to be. It's children's coming of age story if you want it to be. It is all of these things. It is romance. It is action. It is everything. So call it a science fiction story if you want to. Don't if you don't want. They don't care. They've made less money. Does science really have to be strange? Science does not have to be strange. Science often chooses to be strange. It's up to science. I have no control over science or strangeness. Yep.
Sir, I think there's a question in the beginning by Susan George. Do you find that genre fiction, especially high fantasy, detective fiction, romance, etc. in India, is often derivative of Western literary traditions?
Sure. Why not? Like, genre fiction, first of all, doesn't really exist in India. Because again, the publishing mechanisms for these genres don't exist. If you're looking at the origins of genre, there are various genres. What happens is you have work published by mainstream publishers that people call romance or crime or sci-fi or fantasy and all of that. They are often derivative of Western traditions simply because they're familiar to you only because of their adherence to that tradition. The reason why myths don't get filed in the fantasy bookstore, sections of any bookstore, is one, that people get offended. Two, that because they are different than your Harry Potters and what have you, they are placed elsewhere. They're placed under a midsection. Books that can broadly be seen as similar to Harry Potter are placed under fantasy. Therefore, you have your kind of self-selection into similarity with Western tropes and Western publishing things. So I don't know if that's, any more derivative of the West than the West is derivative of itself, because when you're looking at what you're essentially looking at is the globalization of a form of writing. Now, if that form of writing, if that genre of writing has certain set expectations, however fluid those expectations are, then if you follow those expectations in the production of your work, are you being derivative or are you just following the stream of it? Are you being judged extra harshly for following the stream of it because you're not white? You shouldn't be, right? Like, what is the absolutely originally Indian tradition of SF or fantasy that if you wrote in it would somehow find the publisher anywhere? That doesn't exist. Which is why, whenever it comes to questions of like authenticity, derivativeness, etc., the nature of conformity to cultural productions norms, the complexities of representation and diversity in all of these fields, results in a multi-dimensional tangled maze where your interpretation, you can literally decide what your opinion is in advance, positive or negative, about anything, and find examples to fill that particular argument. So I would say that if you think, say, a crime story done by an Indian author is derivative of the West, chances are it's just trying to be a crime story. And that if it was also a story of a crime, but it did not follow the trends of familiar crime stories, it would probably not be filed under crime. It would be a crime that occurred in lit fic or a crime that occurred in commercial fiction. So it's a tangled question, really. Yeah.
I think we have time for around 2 more questions. If anybody has any questions, please put it in the chat box. Yes, Gayatri. Do you want to continue the conversation? We have several questions. We're just very mindful of the time.
Gayatri's been passed the ball. What will she do?
So I've been reading Simakin Prophecies. So each page makes me laugh. But
Thank you.
there is one particular scene which made me laugh a lot. I'm not sure if. Okay, so it's the scene where there's a stork and his name is Jnanasundaram.
SP Jnanasundaram.
Yes, and so it's he's caught, and the line goes like, what would the beautiful S. Padma Lakshmi and their loving children S. G. Raju and S. G. Balasubramaniam do without his tenderness and guidance? So this line, especially the names, kind of made me laugh. And what I wanted to ask is, the SG
why on earth would I do that?
That and this SG Balasubramaniam kind of sounds similar in a way, like musically speaking. Yeah. So
why? Yeah. So the thing with Simakin Prophecies is that when I wrote it, I was 22, right? So one of the things that I was wanting to do is that it actually relates to the last question we were discussing, is that I wanted to do a multicultural fantasy world where everything was like, where the white people were side characters, where there'd be one token white character, rest are in the north and the west, and there's a vast array of civilizations and cultures and mythologies and their conflict with each other. But it's this part of the world. It's the Middle East. It's Africa. It's India. There's Greece and all of that. But this whole, Arthur and all his friends can go, as far as I was concerned. So, when I was naming different features, and I had a lot of fun, right? I just came up with different naming systems for everything. And the thing is, with something like Tolkien, for example, so much sort of text has been devoted, the naming systems, here is a family tree, here is this, here is that. I was like, there are so many lovely names in this country, right? And so it was like with the naming system of the stocks, for example, you could be S, H, C, or I would be your first initial, stock, heron, crane, or ibis. And the second initial would be the father's name or the mother's name for the lady stocks. And that was it. It was just it was also nice to put these names into a book where traditionally as Indian writers, you'd be told, at least at that point of time, oh, these names are so difficult, we can't handle these names, etc., etc. Take these names and eat them, because if we can we can handle all your random ass 4-syllable Welsh, Elvish names. That's not a problem. So take a Balasubramanian, enjoy. This is the character's name, deal with it. And and so, so it was not, obviously at the time, it was not like a very structured thought process. It was just that doing these things was fun. That was if I'm naming a family of stocks, and of course the implicit civilization of stocks that follows under it, who have a particular role to play in the story, then why on earth would I call them, I don't know, Storky, when there are just so many names that one can use and a lovely little system one can build around it.
Yeah, I mean, you having fun with the text kind of comes throughout the pages.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's something which, I mean, I started reading it during the pandemic, like when the classes started, and it was, I mean, I always felt a disconnect between the online world, which classes kind of offered, and just going back to it was a really fun experience. Like,
that's so lovely to hear. Thank you so much.
I wanted to ask a question that in some ways very related to what Gayatri was just saying. In one way, it is loving that idea of play that comes through in your work. But I wanted to discuss fandom and the fan base. This is something that Gayatri brought up in our conversations. She said that, do you want to ask a question, Gayatri?
So the reason I kind of got to know about your book was through Shafali ma'am, who told that she had written a fan letter to you and you had written back.
That is so sweet. And, we will all hang around and we will have a wild party when Shafali ma'am's books take the world by storm. That is my plan, at least. And
yes.
Yeah, I was, sorry, go on.
So how do you manage, or how do you find time to have conversations with fans, especially this? I mean, do you find it annoying talking to?
No, why? It's the best thing. I mean, the idea that, first of all, yes, there are lots of writers who are very rude as people. That's their bad upbringing. I can't help it. But the idea that someone in this completely dried up, squeezed out, chaotic world has the time to read a book and respond to it in the middle of, I don't know, TikTok before it was banned, is lovely. So if people write to me, then it's just wonderful. And you'll find that, this is also something that has changed a lot with social media and so on. Writers who are in the thick of it are only too happy to respond when people write to them. Sometimes you can't do all of it, but it's lovely when people, especially when writers reach out. Now, I might not be able to help everyone with publishing or read their work and all of that, because time constraints come into that, right? When you're writing yourself, it's hard to read other things because those creep into your work. It's hard to also read long form because sometimes things break your concentration. It's very difficult to keep your head in the game when you're writing long form. But conversations with people is something that sustains writers. It's something that writers enjoy. It's something that is lovely. So I consider myself very lucky that Shafali ma'am found the time to write me a letter, and I do not consider it extraordinary at all that I wrote back to it with great joy.
Yes, we wanted to ask this because both of us discovered that we came to know about you through Shafali. So Shafali gifted me Turbulence. It's actually her copy. And Yeah, and Gayatri came to know of the Simukin prophecies because of Writing Desk, which is, it's a time when all of us come together and write.
Right.
So I wanted to bring up the idea of fandom because you also talked about how word of mouth, talking to other people is one way we discover books.
Yeah.
I think this is happening in its own online form in
It is the only way. It is the only way that books survive. Because marketing budgets and whatever, like there have been so many attempts to kind of structure and monetize the book discovery process. There's, now you have to pay to have book displays in bookstores. You pay for coverage, and I don't do any of that. No need. But the the process of finding books has become so gamified and so structured, and so kind of every step of it has become so finance and influencery, right? That the and a part of this is because obviously the publishing industry, despite all its many woes, is big money. And publishers like studios are able to manufacture hits. But the thing is that there is always a point where the book meets a reader. Now, you can make one book a hit with sheer amounts of money, but readers know better than anyone else, right? So for a book to survive, it is only when someone reads something and likes it enough to pass it on to someone else. And I have been very lucky actually that this happened to me early in my career, because it's a hard world to be a writer in. It's just not, I mean, it's not, I don't want to moan about it, because I feel like, not many people manage to hang around for 20 years and still not be completely dried up. But it's not the easiest profession to choose. And had I known how challenging it would be at 22 when I started, then I, might have gotten myself a job first. But but publishers also know this. Ultimately, people have to love the book. What the number of those people is less relevant, except to the author's own income, which is no one else's problem, really. But books only survive when people talk about it. So, it's truly lovely actually to be having a conversation about, say, Simukin or Turbulence, which are 20 years and about 11 years old, right? So yeah, thank you very much for that. It's truly a lovely experience to be talking about things in them.
Yes, so for one final question before we wrap this up. So when I was reading Turbulence again, I noticed that you kind of peel back layers for the reader. Things get connected in very interesting intersections. For example, I didn't realize that Veer is the person they were calling Superman until embarrassingly late.
Right.
And I didn't realize that Amman was the person that Veer was talking to in the beginning. Until a little later.
Right.
And not just that, the very beginning scene itself, where we see Balwant Singh, Veer's father, dangling him over the edge of the Eiffel Tower. I remember feeling very gripped by the idea of, oh no, how is this father holding his child over the Eiffel Tower? And then you realize he's preparing to kind of throw him up in the air and catch him again. And I felt that this unfeeling came with a lot of delight somehow in the writing process. Could see a lot of play in the book. And that's something that I wanted to ask you about, also in terms of the challenges that you face while writing, because this is something that I think a lot of people groan about the difficulties of writing, and it was very exciting to see the excitement in your writing as well. So I wanted to ask you about both these aspects.
No, that's a lovely question. See, I mean, I remember I think through my 20s, writing was just fun, right? And part of it is that I got lucky, right? In the sense that Simukin took off, and to everyone's surprise. And then so I just got to write some more books. So I kept doing that. Now the thing with books is, even if in India, even if you write bestsellers, you don't really make any money. Right? Not enough for grown-ups to live on. So you have to do things like work in comics, work in the movies, and so on, which I started doing also. And I think that was when I first encountered the very rigid conformities of storytelling industries. Because when it's a pretty low budget industry, but with a reasonably organic readership possibility, then no one really tells you this is how we want our story, right? But then suddenly you find yourself. So for me, the biggest challenge is kind of, it's less fun to write according to anyone else's notes. I'm not talking about dealing with editors. Now, Editors are lovely. Editors will improve your story. But if you're working in comics, you're working in the movies, and you send something and someone says, no, don't kill this person here, or put this thing in your story. That's not fun. And especially if you're spoiled like I was and I've written my own stuff and I don't want to deal with this meeting, whatever it is. So the last book, like City Inside, and the one that's coming out this October, which is called The Gin Bot of Shantiport, and it's about a young woman and a robot monkey brother. These were the first books where for the first time, I'm kind of looking at the conformities of American genre, and the way that industries function. And this is something that I'm only able to do now because I spent so long working in Bollywood and other horrible places. So and this is also something where, because it's been over 2 decades or just about 2 decades, there obviously, experience brings some ability to see things that you couldn't see before. So for me, the challenge in writing is not so much the production of text, but finding on the one. So I mean, I loved what you said about my earlier books, because I really did have a very good time writing them. And when I'm writing them, I did not care what anyone would think about them. I felt very lucky when people liked them. But the whole point was, I have stuff to say. I think someone is giving me a little window to say it. I'm going to say it before everything shuts down. But we've had so much kind of cultural change over the last decade, and this is reflected so much in both industrial culture and corporate culture and influencer culture and so on, that it feels like there's been an overall lessening of the play side of the what we used to call the creative side. We've gone from becoming a country that appreciated difference to a country that is very insistent on single stories and single conformities and adhering to them and adding numbers to them and living your life by those rules. And the rest of the world is not that different. It's just that the conformities are different, right? So when you're publishing in other countries, the hoops that you're supposed to jump through, as being an Indian writer, being an Indian genre writer, it's also something that they didn't know existed until about a decade ago. It's hard to navigate those conformities. It's not as hard as dealing with, say, the film industry, where it's much more in your face. But it is always challenging to find that intersection of something you'd like to do and something they'd like to sell. So that has been the big challenge.
Okay, sir. So Limhatham has rephrased his question.
All right.
So
I will try. I will give it my best shot. How is the question of identity crisis used in science fiction? Science fiction is all about identity crisis, especially in cyborgs. Cyborgs are a pinnacle of identity crisis. What happens to human identity when it is installed in robotic systems? I do not know what happens to human identity when it's installed in robotic systems. I would like to be installed in a robotic system, frankly, because growing old, and I'm very old, it's not fun. So yeah, I'm willing to be a test subject in this regard. The borders of humanity are ever shifting, right? Because right now, we are all people who are technologically assisted to the point where people in the 1950s or 1960s would think of us as vaguely robotic. We are culturally driven to modes of expression that are increasingly becoming narrower and narrower, and heading towards, and on the other hand, you have machine learning and AI and all of that producing text and art like humans are supposed to do. So I don't think we'll ever reach what in SF is called the singularity, but we're certainly heading there. And identity crisis is just a part of it. I hope that answers your question. Shefali ma'am has forwarded a question from Jaren. Hi, first of all. We did work, governed by laws of nature, so we did. This one we've done. Yeah.
Indeed. Okay. I think we can wrap up our session here.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for coming here today, sir. It's been a lovely, lovely time talking to you.
Cynthia ma'am, Gayatri ma'am, it was an absolute pleasure. It was, I really enjoyed talking with you. And thank you for inviting me. I had a truly lovely time.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
That's it. Cool. Bye then.